Good morning, folks. My name is Rob Eyler. I'm working with Chabin Concepts and Urban Scenarios on what's called the Chico Economic Vitality Strategy. Between May 4 and 5, we did some presentations in Chico, and on May 5, 6, and 7, Audrey Taylor and Thatch Moyle from Chabin Concepts and Urban Scenarios, respectively, moved around Chico and met with a lot of groups. So this video and this presentation are really just if you were unable to make some of the meetings or you wanted to do a little bit slower dive into the data that we presented, this is why we're here today. So the economic vitality strategic approach is as follows. We want to talk about where are we now. We're going to do a lot of that breakdown here in terms of the pressures that are on Chico and the reason why this strategy makes sense in terms of trying to relieve those pressures. We want to talk briefly about where we want to go, or in other words, what does a healthy economy look like for a city economy? And then ultimately, our plan is going to provide some metrics and some ways to view that through the lens that's specific to the city of Chico. And then how do we get there? The other thing that our strategy is going to do is it's going to provide a roadmap of actions to take vis-a-vis the conclusions we make from the data and from our conversations around the city and around Butte County and to a certain extent around the region about where Chico is going and the things it can do to really get to top of wallet for both commercial and visitors that are, or commercial businesses and visitors that are thinking about Chico as a place to spend and a place to invest and beyond in terms of what the city can reap from the roadmap we provide in terms of lifting all boats. In our mind, the way we think about that is we need to grow the economy. In other words, we need to have an engine underneath the city that actually wants to have the economy grow. And we're going to talk about the metrics with respect to that in just a second. But the second part of it, which is kind of a nuance that some cities and counties miss along the way, is improving the quality of that growth. In other words, we want to think about growth not just through two lenses or three lenses, meaning that we sort of have these stalwart employers, and this is where we want to go. We want to think about those as driving the economy, but then broadening the base of the economy where we get more wage and income opportunities for local residents. In case of Chico, for Butte College and Chico State students to potentially come and stay in the city and in Butte County and utilize Chico as a regional economic hub and lift the foundational aspects of the city economy. And by doing that, we would be capturing more value of the incomes that are generated within the city economy. And when you add all that together, that is in essence the pathway to economic vitality from our angle. What I'm going to do over the next few minutes is I'm going to talk about some of the pressures that an economic vitality strategy would potentially relieve. In other words, our focus is going to be if we think that these pressures are really strong headwinds on the city of Chico, what strategies and what roadmap can we put together in such a way to relieve those strategies and think about a better tomorrow for the city of Chico and being, at the end of the day, more globally competitive? And you might think, well, globally competitive sounds like a really big swing to take. And the answer is if you don't take that swing, there's 100 other cities and counties that are trying to take that swing and pull everybody away from you. So you've got to think global, and if you can capture global, great. If you can capture national, state level, regional, that's still good. It's just really about getting more competitive and being in front of a lot of people and having those eyeballs think about Chico first. To start with, there's some metrics that we use as in terms of measuring a local economy. So GRP growth is what's called gross regional product growth. And what that really means is an analog to gross domestic product, or think of incomes or value added incomes that are made locally and are retained locally. So, for example, you might have a firm locally that produces a lot of income, but if their employees are scattered all over the place and their headquarters is three people is in the city of Chico, those 25 or 30 employees that are scattered all over the place generate those incomes, generate that spending outside, and that income is not retained locally. So we want to measure what incomes are retained locally and what industries are driving those incomes. And that should also tell a story about jobs growth and what industries are driving jobs growth. So being in those percentage ranges is, generally speaking, if you look at economic history in the United States, a good pace of growth in terms of healthy economies have that kind of pace. And California, for example, has really slowed down since the pandemic with respect to that pace. Wage growth and median income growth are somewhat also hand in hand and are kind of driven by GRP and jobs growth in the sense that as that first set of growth takes place, it should reap rewards locally in terms of seeing wages slowly grow and potentially faster than not only inflation, but maybe the state average wage in terms of its rising over time. And that should lead to higher median incomes for households. The business environment locally should be one that is competitive and thinking business first, at least on the margin. That can be tricky in certain political environments. In Chico, specifically since the campfire has had a really roller coastery, if you will. I know that's not an amazing English, but has been up and down in terms of the political environment in such a way to think about business first. So we need to think about that, and that's more of a qualitative layer on top of the city economy with respect to where we're going next. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the strategy and the roadmap. And then ultimately, the sum of those parts should lead to more local revenue, which then helps provide more services to the local residents and the local businesses. And when you add all those up, we want to think about those as sort of a dashboard in a car to see how well the car is driving forward. So pressure one is about population. So if you actually came to the presentation on on May 4 and 5, I actually changed these numbers, which had changed on me in the little span of time between the time we finished this presentation and the time we presented, and added the 2026 data. The story is very similar, but here's the story briefly. The blue line is Butte County since the year 2000 in terms of its population. So you can see the two sharp cuts that took place after 2018, the campfire and then the pandemic. And some of that population, as you see the red line, which is the city of Chico, rearranged itself and reallocated toward the city of Chico when Paradise was basically lost. We've seen some of a pickup since then. We're about just under 209,000 people in Chico, which is just north of the population that was there in the year 2003. For Chico, it's about a little over 108,000 people, which is lower than the estimate just 1 year ago. But the bottom line is Chico is still about 52% of the county population was about 32% actually in 2003, not 2001. But here's the bottom line. The rearrangement of the population toward Chico has done a bunch of different things for the city of Chico. In some ways, it's sort of centralized consumption of goods and services. In the sense that it hasn't been as spread out and it hasn't been, unfortunately, when the city of Paradise was lost, the there's all kinds of tragedies in the wake of that. For the city of Chico, it removed some small amount of regional competition, but then the opportunity cost of that is it's put a much bigger pinch on the city to provide resources, including housing, including public services, in such a way that it was not expecting that growth. So some of what we have to do is suggest, well, what can we do given those conditions? And again, thinking about how do we relieve those pressures. The next population look, in terms of seeing it through a more of a forecasting lens, is where things may be going. So the Department of Finance in California provides these population data and these demographic estimates. If you look forward, Butte County has this look to it, thinking 2025 is where that red line is. Because in essence, that was the latest data when these forecasted data came out about 6 weeks ago. It looks really good on the surface. There's about 7 or 8 counties in California that have a similar trajectory of population growth toward 2050, as does Butte County. Shasta County has this look instead. So you can see that we're still going to kind of climb in Shasta County toward the middle of the next decade and then start to fade. And that is a reflection of an aging population primarily. And also rural California generally has that outlook by the nature of rural spaces in California. We do not expect an enormous amount of growth, basically north of Yuba and Sutter counties toward the Oregon border. This is California's growth on average as a state. So when you look at the Butte County data, it may give you some pause because you say to yourself, well, where are people going to go? Some of this is a bet on Paradise continuing to see rebuild and people coming back to Butte County looking at sort of Paradise 2.0 as a place to live. But at the end of the day, let's assume that those somewhat play out. If those play out, there'll be about 230,000 people that live in Butte County, which will put Butte County basically right back just under where it was pre-fire. So this is really a reclamation project in terms of where population may go, not necessarily growth. Now, if you're in the city of Chico and you think the last few years has been tough because there's been so many more people there than was expected, this actually may give you some relief in the sense that as growth takes place, it might take place in other parts of Butte County, but some of this is also going to be at least looking at Chico as a place to live. Shasta County will be 5% below the pre-fire population, which is below the pandemic population, just under 180,000 people. So the North State, generally speaking, has somewhat of a slow moving, you can even say, net stagnant from the mid 2010s population outlook, not unique to rural places in the United States, but something to think about from a workforce standpoint and what it means for local talent to provide jobs to local businesses. Now, those two pressures have shadow effects. And so what we're going to talk about now are sort of two angles on those shadow effects. When you think about what's happened to the city of Chico and hiring specifically, but then really what's coming with respect to those forecasts based on what's recently happened. So this is one way of viewing that pressure when you think about the number of people working for a Chico-based employer. So if you there's about three forecasts out there, and the data at the city level are somewhat parsimonious, and you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt and try to think about how do I kind of Frankenstein the data together in such a way that A, makes logical sense, and B, really reflects where third parties that don't have any skin in the game are really seeing the status quo outcomes from the local economy. So the actual data end in 2024. Then the forecast is 20 for 25 forward. And you can see easily what happened with the number of people working in Chico toward the pandemic. So it was a little bit of a boost after the fire, and some of that was the beginning of rebuilding. Then the downturn, which was classic throughout the state in terms of that initial cut in the number of people working, and then back up toward recovery and then expansion. So this is actually a pretty good story for rural California in terms of Butte County recovering and expanding a little bit through 2025. There are parts of even suburban California, Sonoma and Marin counties as standouts for better or for worse, because I'm from Sonoma County, have still not recovered the number of people working at locally based employers from before the pandemic. So Butte County at least has that characteristic with respect to providing momentum going forward, but then pretty, slow but steady growth toward the end of the decade. The key is that what the shadow effect of the campfire and the pandemic have done is they've removed people from the local labor force. And by doing that, you lose the value added income from those, which remember that dashboard has that mix of both jobs growth, wage growth, median income growth, but then also local value added income growth. That gap is what would have happened in terms of the number of workers, but for the fire and ultimately the pandemic. But you really should think of the pandemic as a general problem. What really makes Chico stand out in terms of an economic pressure that we've got to think about ultimately leaving behind, as in way deep in the rearview mirror, is the campfire. So that gap is about 7,300 people just to the city of Chico. The county of Butte's larger than that. It's more like 11,000 people if you take the entire county into consideration. And so the pathway out is the retention of talent. So this economic pressure should be able to be relieved. The more talent can be locally retained. However, if we think about the big picture pressures and think about what that means, the talent pipeline, or how changes in population and changes in local labor force participation, which then becomes local workers for local businesses, may have this outlook if you do nothing. So if you think of a status quo forward look, economic history, if you look at the wide continuum from what will happen in western and northern Los Angeles as a result of what happened with the Pacific Palisades fire, all the way to the other side of the spectrum, which is still the New Orleans metro area in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, it is still not recovered from that. If you look at the data, this is a potential outcome. In the short term, you'll see more workers that are moving into the 40 to 59-year age group, and the workforce will slowly age. And it will become more apparent to employers that are looking at workers locally and saying, wow, it's tougher to find younger workers. Then 5 or 10 years from now, you're going to see people start to leave jobs. This will also be true in the public sector in terms of people creeping up on when they max out with their retirement incomes, and they'll say, okay, well, I'm basically paying to be at work now, so off I go. And when that happens, that is also going to rearrange the labor force to a certain extent. The supposition is that will not happen all at once, but it'll be a slow wave. And then 10 years and beyond, you'll start to see some shifts in terms of a structural imbalance. It might be that you have a change in the way that the local economy is consuming goods and services, how much they're eating out at restaurants, how much they are engaged with the local community, how hard it is to find people to volunteer, a bunch of different things that will shift the economy toward a more service heavy, older, consumer based economy. So the idea is that with that pressure, we want to think about what we can do. Well, one lens we can look at is looking at it through a talent pipeline. So Chabon Concepts and I and Urban Scenarios in other cases have thought about this in four categories. In other words, if you look at your population and you think about their ages, not everybody's going to work, but at the same time, how many people are available in certain age groups that we need to be watching? So this is just the recent history and really thinking about it as post-pandemic. The talent pipeline are people between the ages of 0 and 19, meaning how are local households generating kids that are going to grow up locally who may become local labor force participants. That pipeline has slowly faded, about 2.7% since 2020, the latest data from 2024, which I said earlier. Prime workers, which is the age group between 20 and 39, has grown up a little bit. And this is why over the next 5 years or so, you're going to see a little bit more of a migration into that 40 to 59-year range, part of which is the experienced workers and also the retiring soon workers. The experienced workers have kicked up a little bit. The retiring soon workers have kicked up a little bit since 2020. But the idea is the distribution of workers is moving to the right in terms of age. And that, again, is not unique to Chico or Butte County or California, but it's something to watch. And the beauty of Chico and really Butte County sort of writ large is that there are talent pipeline engines that are here between Butte College and Chico State University that provide that. Retaining talent, as we said earlier, is a key way to think about moving out of this. However, Chico is in a competitive environment in California for new talent. And you might say, well, won't AI undermine that? And the answer is, well, economists are somewhat split on that in the sense that AI is likely to enhance productivity in the front end. And we may not have a complete revolution across all industries in terms of the replacement of labor, but we know there's going to be some of those pressures. The key is that if the supposition is you're going to have an increase in the productivity of labor on the front end, you're going to be looking for workers while the getting is good. So, can Chico retain the talent it naturally attracts on an annual basis, given that there's going to be some competition for that talent in the broader urban areas, not only in California, but really around the world? Now, the good news is that both Chico State University and Butte College have seen some turnaround. And this picture for Chico State's headcount in terms of the total number of students is not unique to Chico State, but it is something to watch for in terms of how it is realized in the city economy and also to a certain extent in the county economy, which may access the city as a regional hub for goods and services consumption. So, two things are happening in terms of this. The good thing about that turnaround is that even with 500 more students on campus that come from the outside, that is 500 more people that could be retained as local talent, local working families, local lifelong residents that start to rearrange that talent pipeline in such a way to get more of that distribution moving to the left. So part of the goal structure of this economic vitality strategy is to think about what can be done to retain that talent. And just as a side note, this is not about community development. So one of the things that's kind of a nasty juxtaposition is talking about economic vitality without thinking about place, housing, municipal services, the nature of the business environment in full, right? We alluded to that when we think about those metrics, but when we really get deep down, there needs to be these parallel lines walking alongside of each other in such a way that when people start kicking the tires in Chico and saying, hey, maybe I want to locate there, think from a site selector viewpoint. What does that mean in terms of saying, okay, this is what's going to put Chico over the hill in terms of those choices and make it top of wallet when commercial businesses or visitors think about where to go? Because you can have a tourism strategy, you can have a commercial real estate strategy, but you've got to be able to differentiate yourself from an extremely competitive environment or within a competitive environment that has gotten more competitive over the last 5 years. The second part is that when a student comes to Chico, they bring income with them. So for every 1,000 students, I just recently did a study, and we've done it over the last couple of years for the collective at Chico State University in trying to measure the economic impact of students coming to Chico State. And about every 1,000 students leave $28 million of income or bring $28 million of income that becomes local spending over the year that they're here. And as that growth takes place, that economic base simply lifts up. So we want to continue to see that turnaround. Butte College has a very similar turnaround. The amount of income and the amount of spending that comes per student is a little bit less by the nature of how the students are coming to community colleges, but still that if they're unique students, they're bringing that additional parallel line of positivity toward Chico and toward toward Butte County. So we need to support this continued growth, and we have to think about these institutions as places of two big items in any vitality strategy that are differentiated from the North State generally, and to a certain extent from many other communities throughout California and throughout the Western United States, in terms of having these two engines of talent and potential businesses that would come out of that talent. So, how much more, or how much an entrepreneurial spirit can be built in Chico where it connects to these people that would not be at Chico but for the two institutions of higher learning, making those dots more connective is a critical factor in terms of broader economic vitality strategy and also relieves that pressure of a lack of talent. So, one of the big questions is there room for more? And this is true for both institutions. There are some funding issues in terms of both Chico State University and Butte College, but the more upward pressure there is, the more that those constraints can be relieved in terms of, let's say, the chancellor's offices in both cases. So another pressure is what's been happening with sales tax revenue. If you look at the progression in the percentage or the percentage change in specific categories of where the city of Chico generates its sales and use tax revenue, these are the classic categories that the city follows, and their sales tax consultant HDL basically takes the sales tax revenue that comes in and then places it in these categories, and then looks over time at the data and provides some ways of the city of Chico sort of relieving pressure or looking to enhance where growth is. These data on the blue columns are from right before the pandemic to the latest data, calendar year 2019 to calendar year 2025. Growth generally across the board, except for two cases. One, we've seen a little bit of slip in terms of general consumer goods, which means that which are you can think of as the taxable sales outside of everything you don't buy on the internet, which are kind of put into the state and county pools, short of somebody buying a car some other place and putting it in place and driving it home, and then adding a little bit more tax revenue because they live in Chico, but they bought the car in Sacramento. Building and construction popped up primarily because of rebuild, but also because of a remodeling explosion that took place when interest rates went down in the early 2020s. And then you see the car sales there on the far left-hand side. The business and industry column is one of the intriguing ideas on this graph in the sense that that's where you get so-called use tax or these business-to-business transactions. Like think of buying equipment from an equipment wholesaler or from an equipment manufacturing and putting it into place at a bakery or at a sheet metal fabrication facility, those kind of transactions. That's the entire 6 year stretch. This is the latter half of that 6 year stretch. So some of this, again, not unique to Chico, but something to think about, is where we've really seen a change in two ways. One, we've seen incomes flatten out, especially after the pop during the pandemic, and that change is starting to show itself into the total sales tax revenue. Recent inflation re-engagement has also changed the way, especially our lower to middle income households are consuming because inflation is by its nature a so-called regressive tax. So we needed to expect some of that was happening. Notice that restaurant and hotels still kind of popping along. And part of that is that we saw this continued enhancement of travel. And we also have a little bit of what's called a K-shaped economy in the sense that folks at higher incomes are still going out to eat quite a bit and still spending. And some of that is more on lifestyle, let's say, than on just general consumer goods, if you will. But the bottom line is that when we talk about the local revenue, we're watching sales tax revenue as a way of saying, are consumers feeling better? And are their wages and median incomes rising in such a way that they're consuming more goods and services, or is it fading? Healthcare is our final pressure, and it's both a good and bad story if you see it through the two lenses. The good story is healthcare is a foundational industry in terms of providing expected infrastructure to a local area for new businesses, growing businesses, new residents. They want strong healthcare, and Enloe Hospital provides that. The loss of the hospital in Paradise and its future fate is out there. But the cool thing is that's a potential opportunity to further enhance healthcare as that foundational aspect of the local economy. These are the jobs for Chico overall. This is basically a redo of the graph we saw earlier through 2030 in terms of the number of jobs at local employers. And this is the evolution of that at healthcare. So the left-hand axis is Chico, the right-hand axis is healthcare. the number of workers. But the bottom line is healthcare took less of a dip and has grown a little bit more completely over the last few years, simply because it wasn't in recovery as much as it was in expansion. Chico is catching up a little bit, but we have to think about healthcare as it grows as this positive engine of skilled workers at relatively higher wages than just other jobs plucked at random, especially in services industries. But that can also be a sort of a vacuum of talent and a way of rearranging the way we think about a broader base of the economy. So we need to think about how we diversify the economy, given that healthcare is a beautiful engine going forward, and really putting other services and other amenities around healthcare as it grows, just as one example of a foundational industry that also needs support from the rest of the economy and its vitality. Can we help realize the ultimate potential of this? So part of it will be for the region, what happens with the other hospital over time. But we expect healthcare to continue trucking along. The negative of this on part two is that it's also reflective of an aging community. And really, because Chico is a regional hub, is not just Chico aging, but the remainder of the North State aging, utilizing Enloe as a regional hub hospital. So to start wrapping up, we're going to think about the business mix. And when an economic vitality strategy is engaged, one of the ways in which it's engaged is to have it focus on what types of businesses we can enhance. We're going to see this through two lenses. In a few minutes, we're going to talk about the mid-market businesses, or these businesses that have between 20 and 99 employees as a focus. Most communities are engines of small businesses because people are entrepreneurial, they start a business. Can the local area retain that mid-market, or will those small businesses start to mature and grow and then go away because the local economy does not support, either through a lack of space, a lack of services, a lack of business-friendly environment, a lack of local workers, a lack of general amenities, sometimes maybe including housing, to support that growth? The great thing is, if you look at that mid market and look at the number of the amount of the payroll, it's about 35% of the payroll in Chico's economy. And the beauty of that is that when you think about those businesses maturing, do they mature in such a way that you really get that juice of higher wages, right? Because there could be that you're kind of stuck at the lower end of that mid market. But if those businesses are growing toward those larger businesses, that's really where you get the juice of saying, this is the story I want to tell about doing business locally. The amount of payroll and the amount of jobs are not 100% because there's some suppression of the data. And also, we're not counting government jobs in that count directly. That's why it doesn't sum up to 100. But bottom line is our strategy is going to talk about mid-market firms primarily. Now, alongside of that, another sort of cut in terms of the businesses that are local are what we're going to call core, supporting, and emerging. And if you look at the number of workers specific to the city of Chico, looking forward toward 2030, but also from 2017, so think pre-fire on through, these core employers, healthcare, education, advanced manufacturing, ag tech as it exists, has grown and looks like it's going to continue to grow. Some of that has been has been driven by healthcare. That's why we want to kind of link those two ideas. The emerging businesses are primarily in things like food and beverage, like core entrepreneurship and tech. Some of that's going to be in arts and thinking more about how entrepreneurship and tech and creative arts kind of find a merger space. And it looks like it's going to grow just a little bit. But what we want to focus is turning those emerging and core industries, when they're smaller business just starting up, into those mid-market businesses. The supporting jobs are basically everything else, inclusive of government, where that support mechanism is a way of diversifying the economy. So we want to lift that foundation, but we want to lift it because the core and the emerging businesses grew and pulled the supporting cast behind it. So we can't have an economy that's vital without the supporting cast, but we should not rely on those supporting industries as our primary growth engine, because if we do, we will have that sort of 10 years plus scenario start to take place, which is exactly the idea of having an aging economy that is very slow growth and may also not be as dynamic as other economies are in terms of businesses thinking about, where do I want to locate and move my smaller business into that mid-market range. This is just a quick look at the most recent help wanted, as to give a perspective on where a lot of the energy is going with respect to local employers looking for workers. You can see a lot of these are in retail and healthcare and in teaching. And that is that sort of blend of core and supporting industries with respect to where the jobs are. So we want to make those jobs more dynamic. And we use this as kind of a gauge of, all right, well, when we start the dynamic movement, are we starting to see that show up in a more, let's say, diverse number of help wanted ads in such a way that it really tells that story that, okay, wow, there's a jobs engine here and off we go vis-a-vis where we were, let's say, 1 or 2 years ago. So, in summary, Chico has headwinds and tailwinds. We've talked about those headwinds. We got population concerns in this talent pipeline. We're concerned about state policy and how the overlay of state policy, for example, in a lot of the cities and counties we've worked in, we've had minimum wage legislation and the augmentation of the minimum wage be a major complaint about growing as a business and what we can or cannot do about that. We know there's a lot of competition out there, and there are broad economic concerns geopolitically, where we're going toward midterms. There's just a lot of noise out there. So those are kind of our core headwinds driven by the pressures we've seen before. The cool thing about the tailwinds is like we talked about with healthcare. Healthcare is a beautiful tailwind for the local economy as long as it keeps on trucking. That's going to help all boats rise. But it might be in a very narrow lane unless we do a little bit more diversification. Chico State and Butte College growing have kind of the same outcome and but expand that talent pipeline. So the new programs that those institutions provide and how much entrepreneurism can be generated and also come as attracted to the workers that would come out of those programs and out of those institutions, that's where you'll get those mid-market businesses growing. That's our working hypothesis. So when you think about where we are, when you blend all that together, we think that higher education and healthcare are drivers of the economy, where the anchor is higher education because it splits two ways. It's a jobs provider and a talent provider simultaneously. The focus on mid-market is where we say, listen, if we're going to have new businesses here, we've got to have a way of getting them to mature. And that really is where community development, commercial real estate utilization, workforce development, and economic development all blend together to work as one engine. So one strategy that may come out is that we need somebody from each one of those four categories, maybe plus the business owner, talk about how that business grew because all those blended toward a unified strategy. That's a critical factor. And then the supporting cast will simply be pulled behind as the rest of the economy grows. If you had a chance to hear Audrey and Thatch over the next few days, a lot was discussed about place. And so some of this other data that's coming and thinking about opportunity areas throughout Chico, and let's say the commercial spaces around Chico will be some of the focus, like that commercial real estate lens. A lot of those data are coming, and we're going to be blending some of these data together to finalize our conclusions. So, in terms of questions to consider, and we're going to give you some contact information here in just a second to wrap up. Uh, are these the right focus areas? Which should be the priorities? Are there specific outcomes that you'd want to see? And are there other areas that are important? So one thing we consistently heard about was housing. So we're not tasked with talking about housing mix or the number of housing units necessary. Community development will take care of that using what we say as a lens by which to finalize that outcome. But if it's something you feel is a hard constraint, smart to say it. We will likely conclude that, but for what happened with housing, you would be in this other place. So you cannot forget about it. And without that, it could be the main constraint you face. And if you feel that way, that's great. And you should tell us that. So, in terms of contacts, if you have any reflections on what you've heard or you have any answers to those four questions, please let us know. This is our contact information. And folks, I thank you so much for getting to this point in the presentation. And if you came and you're looking at this again, thank you for making the time on May 4 or 5 to hear us out. But let us know what you're thinking. That anything you give us helps inform our analysis and our final conclusions toward the city and its economic vitality. Thank you.